A bit of insight and some clarification into the philosophy of Karl Marx. Now, in a nutshell, Marx believed that private property should be abolished and that the means of production ought to be seized so that the workers could themselves receive a fair share of the property that they produced. That's a very basic thumbnail understanding of the philosophy of Karl Marx. And it's not untrue. It is just very incomplete because that is a superficial understanding. What Marx was really getting at is seizing the means of production, but not of the factories on behalf of the workers. Marx was interested in seizing production of ideological property, the intangible. So to understand Marx as advocating for workers, abolishing private property, and seizing the means of production is a very symbolic and metaphorical exercise. The real property and real means of production was ideological or psychological. And you can think of ideology as your most basic set of beliefs. It is the operating system that runs all the programs and software on your brain that you aren't even aware of. Most people go through their entire lives and don't change their ideologies. Most people are not acutely aware of them. They're simply there, and they serve to prop up all of our secondary beliefs. Now, how is American ideology, or the psychological mindset of Americanism, that thing that binds us together, that thing that we all have in common as Americans, how is that produced and maintained? Well, it's produced and maintained largely in schools and in civic institutions and also in the family. And the family also has the effect of reifying or shoring up, reinforcing those ideologies. All of these sort of function like little factories to produce and manufacture the American ideology and to uphold it. Marx knew that the way to seize real power, real tangible power, is to subvert the means of ideological production and reproduction. You do this by defining the mainstream or majority within any given society. And then whoever does not fit perfectly into that majority is by definition marginalized. This is where we get the oppressed versus oppressor narrative. In other words, moving the margins to the center and the center to the margins. You convince anyone not wholly within the mainstream ideology that they are oppressed by those who are. Now, people have all sorts of traits that can technically locate them outside of the mainstream. Maybe you're female, or you're gay, or you're an atheist, or you're overweight, or you're an immigrant, or you live in poverty, or you're not a member of the majority ethnicity or skin color. But in the United States, those characteristics or behaviors just make you imperfect or slightly different or unique. They don't make you oppressed or marginalized. And this is the mistake that people make when they read Marx and they begin to become followers of what I would call a religion. And that is why they have to use the term social justice when they advocate for Marxism, because we actually all have equal shares of actual blind justice in this country, and that is not impacted in any way by characteristics or behaviors. I wouldn't even agree that social justice exists. Justice exists. I know what justice is, and I can apply that knowledge of justice to any given situation, whether it's the law or whether it's on the playground or whether it's in the workplace. I don't need to specifically identify a category and call it social justice. But for Marxists, they need to do this because the people whom they put into these categories as being oppressed by the majority are not actually oppressed. And so if they were, we could simply call it a matter of justice. And that's why they call it social justice. So Marx was primarily interested in re-engineering all of society in a metaphorical way by seizing the ideological means of production and reproduction. This means dominating and remaking the institutions themselves. Now, this is a perfectly rational response to one of the favorite newspeak terms of the Marxist, institutional racism. Where does this come from? Why do they have it? Well, first of all, they can't define it. institutional racism would just be racism within an institution. It's not very much different from describing justice as social justice. They like to break things down into smaller categories and then proclaim themselves experts in these smaller categories. So if you are going to give yourself a just basis for seizing control of the institutions, then you begin with a term like institutional racism. Well, we've got to go conquer this institutional racism. Therefore, we need to seize control of the means of production in the institutions themselves. Now, the role of feminism in this installation of Marxism in the United States, I would argue that feminism, specifically second wave feminism in the late 50s and into the 1960s, is where this began. This was the initial fracture because you convinced essentially half the population in the country that they were being treated unfairly and they did not have equal opportunities. Equal treatment and equal opportunities are both very noble and just goals within a Western society. And so I think that that is a good basis upon which to make your arguments. However, the problem with that is that women are largely inseparable from feminism, whether they realize it or not, to some degree, because they are women. And feminism is a philosophy, a social philosophy that advocates for women. Women are inseparable from female instincts, especially maternal instincts, which causes heightened awareness and concern for the welfare of children. This heightened awareness naturally spills over into broader contexts of life, such as an increase in empathy toward those perceived as weaker or less capable. Now, men tend to be providers and women tend to be distributors. So men would go out and hunt and gather, and women would take the role of making sure that everyone got to eat. These innate tendencies of women are reinforced in light of their own inherent vulnerability within society. So if women have this natural penchant toward caring for the weaker or the incapable, then they themselves are going to be pushed innately to do so in light of their own inherent vulnerability. They are weaker than men. They are less capable in some ways than men to function in society, at least in terms of the way that men are able to function within society. But that just comes down to different innate roles that we have. Now, it's important to note that feminism necessarily always attacks and destroys men, or maleness, or masculinity, if you prefer. It absolutely must do so. So those women who claim that they're feminists, but only in the sense of equality, equal treatment, and equal opportunity, that's fine. Just don't call yourself a feminist, because feminists and feminism itself destroys masculinity. It has to. That's the entire basis. It's the mechanism by which it moves forward toward a more equal situation between men and women. Look, we're different physically and mentally because nature has oriented us toward a cooperative role in the larger scheme of existing in the world. Men and women are not inherently equal across all dimensions because we are inherently different. And therefore, feminism can never attain its goal of total equality across all dimensions. Unless men literally become women and women literally become men, that's never going to happen. Feminism lifts women in the Western social order in part by exploiting perfectly reasonable, sound, and just arguments for equal treatment and opportunity. However, because men and women do differ across so many different dimensions, such as tendencies, desires, habits, tastes, preferences, approaches, etc., this can never be realized without also destroying, in part, the very nature of man. When you carefully consider these features of feminism, and you ask yourself, well, where is a realistic place where such a bizarre experiment would be free to play out and go awry? It is within the universities in the United States. After all, this is the birthplace of feminism. Therefore, it is primarily women and of course the feminized men who empower or acquiesce to them in the universities, who are almost exclusively advancing these feminist-based academic theories and thereby manufacturing and facilitating the downfall of the natural social order. Feminist theories have taken the shape of what they call intersectionality, and it basically means, women weren't treated equally or fairly in society, and so now we can take this and replicate that, and we can look at folks who are not white, who are not straight, who are overweight, whatever it is, we define the marginalized community, and then we take that feminist lens through which to look at it in the Marxist style of oppressor versus oppressed. And then this is basically what intersectionality is all about. And if you have more than one of these traits, if you happen to be a woman who is also Hispanic and then you're a lesbian, then these start to add up. And this is where you get the hierarchy of oppression. So the more traits of these supposed oppressed categories that you have, the higher up the oppressed hierarchy that you will find yourself. Now, given the innate tendencies of women as caretakers and distributors, it should come as no surprise to anyone that these artificially empowered and enabled women in the universities are, perhaps somewhat unwillingly, advancing the most destructive and divisive ideas of so-called intersectionality, this academic doctrine that establishes and orders the throngs of oppressed and dispossessed persons according to their identity or identities. Rather ironically here, women indoctrinated into radical academic feminism are simply behaving according to their natural instincts by advancing and advocating theories that they themselves see as corrective measures to ensure fair distribution and equal consideration. Now, the religious style mantra of diversity, equity, and inclusion was also born in the universities. Of course, it exists in the institutions now where people work and in the HR departments and in the K through 12 schools, but its home is in the universities. The terms diversity and inclusion are actually interdependent. Both of these exist as tools that rely on each other. One cannot have the noble ends of diversity without the righteous means of inclusion. The larger goal here is of the two is to create equity or equitable shares of social commodities such as consideration, treatment, and opportunity. Diversity and inclusion are the very mechanisms that are used to seize, subvert, and change the ideological means of production and reproduction in society. The epicenter of this is located in the universities. It is being perpetuated by radicalized academic feminists who are training the next generation of K through 12 teachers who are going on to take these jobs in K through 12 and radicalizing these children. So when you look around and you wonder, why is it that there's all this gender confusion and gender madness and obsession with trans people? Well, what is transsexuality? It's men becoming women and women becoming men. That is, after all, the final unstated goal of feminism, whether they realize it or not. That's the only way you can ever truly realize all of feminism, is by normalizing this notion that men can become women and women can become men, and there's actually no difference. It's simply this social construct, as they like to call it. Equity is the means by which government enforces equal shares of the property. And if you don't like where things are in society today with this gender madness and with the normalization of sexual predators toward children and everything else that seems so upside down and backwards and baffling and confusing to the rest of us, just wait a couple of years, because we are training an entire fifth column in the K through 12 schools right now. And I can attest to that because I see more and more radicalized students showing up as freshmen at college every year. And that trend is increasing. The rate at which it's increasing is also picking up. It's not slowing down. It's not tapering off. It's getting much worse. And so laying in wait are an entire fifth column of Manchurian candidates that are being trained right now. That's where you go if you really want to establish ideology within a person. You don't wait until they're adults when you have to go in and subvert it and change it and go through it. It takes a lot of work. It takes time. It's not always effective. But if you can get to the children, then you can establish the ideology to begin with. And that's the trouble we're in. And if we don't do something about it, in a few years, you aren't going to believe how bad things get, because what we're seeing right now is nothing compared to what's coming.